To those of you joining us today, thank you for watching the Woburn Spotlight. I'm your host, Tyler Gates, here to bring you some positivity by talking to those in town making big strides for the greater good. Today I'm fortunate to have with me Senator Cindy Friedman. Senator Friedman, thank you for taking the time to get together today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we have a lot to cover. I know there's people in the community that are asking some great questions, and I think we're going to get to a few of those topics today. I've been fortunate to get to know you a bit through Rotary and prior to today's show. But for anyone that doesn't know much about Senator Friedman, do you mind just sharing a little bit about you and what brought you here today?
Sure. Well, what brought me here today was an invitation, which I was really happy to get and glad to be here. So I am the state senator for the 4th Middlesex, which includes Woburn, Arlington, Burlington, Billerica, and most of Lexington. And before that, for 10 years, was the chief of staff to Senator Donnelly. So I got to know Woburn through him, and when he passed away, the seat was open, and I decided that in order to continue the work that we did together, that I would try and run. I would run and see if I could win and see if I could continue. And I was lucky enough to have that opportunity. So here I am.
So here you are, and you worked with Senator Donnelly for a significant period of time prior, if I remember right. Is that correct?
Well, through his whole tenure at the State House, I worked with him,
How many years was that? Please remind me.
It was almost 10.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was. I still miss him every day.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah.
I'm sure you do. So tell me a little bit about you and some of the core values that you're bringing to the table. I know you wanted to help carry on some of the work that you had done prior, but let's hear a little bit about Senator Friedman.
Well, I think one of the reasons why it was so successful for me to run with, to be Ken's chief of staff, was because we shared a lot of the same values. And I guess if you had to say it in a very short set of sentences, it would be really ensuring that everybody has an opportunity, and that it's not our job to give everybody jobs and give everybody income, but it's sure our job as a government to ensure that everybody has equal access. So that means a good education. It means ensuring that there's affordable housing. It means that you get a living wage for a day's work. It means that you have access to health care, that you can, where you can get the help that you need and you can afford that help. It's those kinds of things that I think represent my values, and that I think it's the responsibility of government to just ensure that there's a level playing field. That if you work and if you are part of the community, that you get your basic needs met.
So that brings up a couple of different directions we could go. There's so many thoughts running through my head. Just to kick us off, do you mind sharing a little bit about some of the policies and agendas you've worked on in the past, some of the maybe topics people are very interested in nowadays? I know the opioid epidemic is something that we'll speak to today.
Yep.
But do you mind just taking it whatever direction you'd like there? And I'd love to hear about some of the things that you've worked on too in the past.
Sure. Well, I've worked on language to ensure that children have access to shelter. So if children are homeless, there is a safe place for them and their families to stay, and to try and provide the services that they need, that family needs as a homeless family. I've worked a lot on pay equity and wage theft, so ensuring that if you work for a day, if you work for a week, if you work for a year, you get paid for that work. And it turns out wage theft is a huge problem in the Commonwealth and costs us like over $12 billion a year, just in lost wages, lost taxes. And so that's something that I've been very involved in and was very involved in with Senator Donnelly. And I am the Senate chair of the Mental Health and Substance Use Recovery Committee. And so I've spent a lot of my energy working on mental health, behavioral health, and substance use disorder. All of those bills come to our committee, and we just actually finished a very big opioid bill that the governor signed just a couple months ago.
Do you mind speaking to that a little bit more? I know that was something that a lot of legwork went into.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. It's actually something that I think we should be proud of. So we do a lot in Massachusetts in trying to address the opioid epidemic, which is we're still losing hundreds of lives too. And so this is kind of the next step. So the first step, we tried to limit prescriptions and to better monitor opioid prescriptions, because it was one of the things that really kicked off this epidemic that we have, the kind of irresponsible marketing of the pharmaceutical companies, and then doctors prescribing in quantities that were very dangerous to a lot of people. So now this bill, we take a step further. We do more work on prevention and screening. So there's a trust fund for prevention in the community, especially prevention with younger young people. And we go further in monitoring prescriptions and ensuring that we can keep track of when opioids are prescribed. But what we really made a big stride in medication assistance for opioid treatment or for substance use disorder. So that's access to medicines like Suboxone, Vivitrol, methadone. And we don't have a cure for this illness yet, but we have treatment. And we have to ensure that the treatment that we provide people is evidence-based and evidence-informed, and it's treatment that we know has a track record of working. So the combination of medication and wraparound services for people really seems to be a very positive model for helping people get the treatment and stay on the treatment that they need. So this bill does a lot of work around that. A lot of ensures that that's going to be more accessible. And we deal with pain management a lot. So one of the downsides of all of this monitoring and curtailing is that people who suffer with serious pain, chronic pain, are finding it much harder to get the drugs that they need so that they can just function. I mean, this is getting up and going to work kind of support. So we've done a lot in the bill to say, okay, well, what is pain management? How do we ensure that people who suffer from chronic pain get that care?
Right.
And how do we ensure that our friends at the insurance companies will pay for that treatment? So those are some of the things. We spend, there's some parts of the bill which ensure that mental health and substance use disorder, the co-occurrence of those two things, which is very, very common, that we start to address that dual diagnosis. So those are some of the things that are in the bill, and I think it's a good bill and it's a good start, and we have a lot more to do.
So like you were saying, you kind of focused on early on the education, I would call it, of how do we prescribe this and how often or how much.
Right.
This last bill was said, how do we address this from here? What's next?
Well, I think what's next is to focus, continue to focus on access to treatment.
Okay. Sticking with that bill and working to implement it correctly, right?
And to ensure that we have many entries into treatment. So there's just not one way to get the help that somebody needs, but that there's multiple ways, because it's multiple, different people respond in different ways, and so we have to ensure that we've that we have all of that access. And we also have to look at the social determinants. So the things like besides the fact that we had just this enormous influx of opioids, of just being basically prescribed willy-nilly, we also know that in some cases certain social determinants will exacerbate people who are likely to become addicted. So things like food insecurity and jobs and where you live and do you live in a safe place. And one of the biggest issues that people face, and that is very common among people with substance use disorder, is trauma.
Okay.
And it's early trauma, and so it's where does that trauma come from, and what is it that we can do as policymakers to kind of help that so that trauma lessens, so less people are likely to react or less likely to become addicted.
So I got a question too. I'm kind of stuck in my head, and I'm glad you finished that thought, because I want to circle back.
Sure.
So on a state level, I know the bill has been passed. How does this affect, or how will this be rolled out on a community level? Are we still too early to figure out what that will look like, or opportunity for people to get these treatments, I guess is where I was headed with that.
Well, it will be different. So at the community level, it will really affect the community hospitals, because
Okay.
now people who come into the emergency room are required, with a substance use disorder or an overdose, are required to be offered medication assistance.
Okay.
And if they want it, then it also requires that hospital to ensure that they get an early dose of medication, but that they also get what we call a warm handoff to outpatient or to a treatment.
I had a hard time asking that question, but that's
Yeah.
where I was going with that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's more, so what we're doing is linking up those two pieces.
Those
It's-
resources.
It's kind of like Narcan, which we also have now. There's a standing order that every pharmacy will carry Narcan, and that people will
Didn't know
have
that.
access to that, and you can go to a pharmacy and get it for somebody. So you don't have to be the person that walks in. So if I have a child at home that is, has a substance use disorder and I'm really concerned, I can go to the pharmacy and get dosage. And I will, it will just be a copay.
Yeah.
I won't be charged for it, except for whatever my insurance
That's
copay
good
is.
for people to know that's out there.
Yeah, so those are community. Also, we set up a behavioral health trust fund, so prevent a promotion trust fund, so that there will be money coming in for schools to do screenings and for programs to be established. Again, evidence-based programs that have been proven to work in the schools to help, how do we ensure that this generation coming up doesn't, doesn't become the next scourge of this illness. So those are a couple of the community, I think, pieces. But we're really trying to open the doors to more treatment with primary care physicians, for instance. How do we get more primary care physicians to work with people with substance use disorder? How do we reduce the stigma so people will say, I have an illness and I need help? And not, how do we support our police so that when they're with somebody who's experiencing a psychiatric episode or a substance use, an overdose, that they know what to do to get that person to medical care and not into the jails and prisons. And I think those all affect the community pretty profoundly.
So communication is going to be key moving
Communication is going to be key, and training is going to be key, and
Yes.
access is going to be key.
Good. I know we could spend a good deal of time on the opioid crisis, but I want to segue just briefly into education. I know your opportunity is the word that I heard you say earlier, and I think that we could spend some time there with education and opportunity in the state of Massachusetts. I know there's a few different ways we can go, so I'll leave the stage up to you. And do you mind talking about your past experiences, what you're doing right now, and what you might be doing in the future?
So I was a teacher for 5 years, and I will tell you, I have never had a job harder. And I feel a lot of responsibility as the state senator, but I felt even more responsibility as a teacher. So the combination of the sense of
interesting.
responsibility and how really difficult it is to be a good teacher, it taught me a lot.
I bet it did.
So I think the first thing that we really need to do, and we need to do this as a state, is to fix the foundation budget. So the foundation budget is what determines how much a school needs to educate a student today. And then from there, we determine how much this community can pay and how much the state needs to pay.
Isn't this based on a unique
It's a
formula?
Chapter 70 formula.
I remember you speaking to this
Yeah.
maybe 6-8 months ago. So yes, keep going. I don't mean to interrupt.
And it's been 20 years at least since we've updated it, and things have really changed. So it's missing a lot of pieces that determine what you need to actually educate someone. For instance, the cost of health care for teachers. We don't consider that, and that's a huge investment for cities and towns. That's their education budgets and their town budgets have to go to covering that.
Yeah.
the difference between what you need to help kids who are English language learners or kids who have come in with a developmental disability. And what does that, what kind of education will that entail? So that's just a kind of high level, some of the things that goes into the budget, along with a community's ability to pay and, you know, their property taxes and their, you know, the income and all that. But we have not fixed that formula for a very long time, and it needs to be fixed. Because it's fine if you are a wealthy community and maybe you don't get so much Chapter 70 funding, but you have the property taxes and maybe you have a really large commercial base that helps feed those taxes so that you can cover the true cost of education. But there's many communities where they can't. And so we have to fix that formula because it really determines access. It really determines whether everybody's getting, you know, a fair shot. And it definitely plays out when you've got big income gaps. So when you were a town where the income is low, poverty is high, you may have a very large population of kids who need extra help. That's where it really begins to affect what kind of education you can provide. So we need to fix that formula. And we tried to do it, but the House and the Senate couldn't come to an agreement, so we're going to have to do that again. And then I'm not sure this is a huge issue in my communities, but the way we pay for charter schools in a number of communities is a real problem, and will take some fixing.
Okay, so the communities that you service, you're not seeing that as prominent of
They
an
don't
issue.
see as, we don't have a large portion of our kids going to charter schools. We are lucky enough to live in a district where the schools are, you know, where people feel very good about the schools in general.
That's not the case, it sounds like, over the entire state.
No,
though.
it's not.
Okay.
It's not.
Okay. Now, I know we've gone over opioid education. Really, as you get ready for the next session as well, is there any powerful projects or topics or areas that you see yourself focusing on moving forward?
Well, I'll continue to focus on mental health and substance use, I hope. I mean, I care a lot about it, and we've done a lot of work, and I want to keep going. I think the other piece we really need to focus on, and I am looking at this, is all around workforce development, workforce training. So we are at this funny place where we need a lot of well-trained workers in Massachusetts. That's the type of industry that we have. And so we have a very high-tech, medical, advanced manufacturing, lots of those kinds of industry, STEM. And we have a real industry where it's around the customer, whether it's healthcare or financial services or but nursing care, all of those kinds of where we need a lot of workers and we need them to be trained. And we are at a real shortage of workers. And in fact, we're looking at a significant reduction in available workforce over the next 10 years. But we also need to train people because we have people, they just don't have the training. So we really need to focus on increasing the workforce, and we need to focus that those people who do this work we care so much about, like taking care of our children who are ill or our parents who are ill or you know, healthcare or mental health or substance use disorder, we need to ensure that they can actually do their job because they get paid enough. And right now, they don't. And so we have a real workforce shortage in those areas.
Paid enough and paid for the work they do, and that kind of brings me back to the wage stuff. I know we didn't dive into that, but do you mind elaborating on what kind of wage stuff you're really seeing in Massachusetts and so what we can do about it? Maybe there's not that answer, right?
No one will like what we can do about it, but we can do better. So it's very big we see a lot of wage stuff happens but it really happens, it's very predominant in the construction industry and in the food service industry.
Okay.
So it's where people kind of work
Contract
day to day,
basis?
contract, yeah, cash based.
Okay.
Certainly food is cash based, and so what happens is because there's no accountability. Often people can work, and if the owner or whoever doesn't have the money to pay that week, they say, I can't pay you. And because it's also a place where there's a lot of people who may not have permanent status in those jobs,
Yep.
that it's easier to take advantage
Bully.
of them because
Yeah.
they'll be silent.
Yes.
So we have strong wage force laws. What's going on, especially in the construction company, is that because it's so hierarchical, so we don't, a contractor, a large contractor, isn't the person that actually is doing that day-to-day
Right.
work. They
They
hire
hire
a
A,
subcontractor,
B,
and they
C,
hire
D.
Z, and they. So you get down to this level,
Mm-hmm.
and where's the accountability up here to ensure that they're just following the wage laws? And so if we really want to get very serious about it, we have to have an incentive all the way up the chain so that those bad guys down at the bottom, that we can hold them accountable. And really, this is as much for good contractors as it is for bad, because the good contractors are paying their people, they're providing the benefits, they're paying health care, they're following the rules. And so if I go in to bid on something and I'm carrying these costs, my bid is going to be higher than somebody that walks in and says, oh yeah, I don't pay my workers, and I figure out a way not to have to pay the benefits, so I can charge you less. And that's really not fair to the people who are, and there are a lot of really good contractors who are trying to do the right thing.
Playing by the rules.
We're playing by the rules. So it's really another way to level the playing field and say, hey, if you play by the rules, it's fine. But if you don't, there's got to be some consequences. So I think that's the way I look at wage theft. And it's also ways in which we say you're a contractor when you're really an employee, so that I don't have to pay you benefits. Well,
Yeah.
that's the state's problem. If I say you're a contractor when you're really under every rule makes you an
W-2
employee.
employee, yeah.
And I don't have to pay you the benefits, and that person isn't making enough money, for instance, to buy health care.
Right.
We all buy it for them.
Yeah, we do.
Right? And the company gets to pocket the money. So it's on a different levels, and it's something that
I'm
I
glad
think
I asked
is really.
about that. I was curious. I wasn't
Yeah.
sure how that dynamic looked.
Yeah, yeah.
What else are you hearing from people in the community that you serve? There's so much going on.
I
We could
know.
go so many different
I know.
directions. We only have a half hour,
Yeah.
but what are you seeing and hearing?
Well, in Woburn, I hear a couple things. One is, please don't raise my taxes. I hear that all the time, and I
agree with that.
Right.
I hear that. Yeah, that's fair.
I feel that,
Yep, the internet Woburn, I've heard that.
Right. And then the other pieces are around transportation and housing.
Yes.
Our transportation system is a mess, and it's getting harder and harder for people who live in my district, our 128, 93, greater Boston area, to get to and from places in a reasonable amount of time. And I'm also hearing, and I hear this a lot, in my communities, and I'm starting to hear it in Woburn, the housing prices are getting high. Where am I going to go and what am I going to do? And so this is a real problem for the Fourth Middlesex, because people want to live here. It's close to the city. It's a great way of life. Our schools are good. And people are coming, and they can't live in Boston, and they can't live in Cambridge, so they're moving out and moving out and moving out. And so there's a lot of pressure on Arlington, Burlington, Lexington, Woburn, Billerica for people, to raise their families here, which is wonderful. But it gets to a point where housing becomes scarce, and the housing prices go up, and and maybe property taxes go up, and the people who live here, they start to get priced out. So we need to address that problem, and it's a real sticky problem. But it's what I hear a lot from Woburn and my other communities.
What's going on within the Senate or the House or that's really the Senate that can help address those two issues?
Well, I don't know yet. I think we have to.
Still early on.
It's still, yeah. I mean, it's giving control to the cities and towns around zoning and letting the towns have more control over zoning. Local zoning options, and so getting the sort of getting the state out of that.
Yep.
Somewhat, I think, will help. Inclusionary zoning is something that people are looking at. So I think that's one thing. But then the other thing is we really need to look at our transportation system, and we need to fund it. It is not being funded to the level it needs to be. It is not about, we need to reform it. We've done a lot of reforms. There's not enough money in the system to keep a 21st century transportation system going. So we've got to own that and figure out how to.
I think on that note, the people of Woburn will agree transportation is an issue.
Yeah.
And so I peeked to my left, and we're getting close to the end of our time together, Senator Friedman. Just want to make sure, as you kind of say anything you'd like in closing, speak to our viewers. I just want to give you the floor to be able to speak to them now. So.
Well, it's great to represent Woburn, and tomorrow night there's a great event for the library.
Yes.
There's a mystery dinner, and there will be some very, very fine first-class actors performing in that. And I just hope everybody in Woburn will support the library because it is a wonderful place.
Wonderful place. Well,
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. Great to see you again. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys can get accomplished over the next 6 to 12 months.
I am too.
Oh.
Thanks so much for having
Thank
me.
you for your time. And thank you all for watching today's show with Senator Friedman. Remember, we all have one life to live. Let's all do our part. I'm your host, Tyler Gates. Join us again next time for another episode of the Woburn Spotlight.